We have been hearing a lot of Matthew over the past several Sundays after Pentecost, so I want to make sure that we situate ourselves within what's happening in that story arc and where Jesus is in the story physically. Where he is physically is he has walked into Jerusalem. He has basically been announced by the people as recognized as the heir to David. And he's gone into the temple. He's already sort of overthrown the tables of the money changers. And now the next day he is seated in the outer precincts of the temple complex and doing this teaching. He's been approached previously by the Sadducees, and then now he's being approached by the Pharisees, and all these groups of religious leaders, and also the Herodians prior to this, have also approached him representing the empirical offices. And so he's been answering and teaching for a while now, and all of these challenges have happened. As he's experienced as somehow challenging the authority of the chief priests and the elders, and he responds by telling them basically a few things that are not making them happy, including the fact that tax collectors and prostitutes will make it into God's kingdom before they do. That doesn't necessarily endear them to Jesus. Jesus also alludes to a well-known passage about a vineyard in Isaiah 5, and Jesus calls the Jerusalem elite the wicked tenants, because they have been more preoccupied with their own self-interest than the interests of the people. And then he uses a story of a wedding banquet in which he describes these religious elites as the bullies who had originally been invited as guests at God's table, but are basically judged not to be worthy of that honor. So by now in his teaching, Jesus has not garnered a whole lot of love and affection from these people he's talking to. And then as they grill him, probably out of annoyance and anger, they have already asked him about the imperial tax. What's the relationship between the Caesar and God? And Jesus responds very much that the primary loyalty of the people must be to God, and yet to give to Caesar the image that belongs to Caesar, but to encourage, invite, challenge the religious to honor the image of God in the people. So as he's evoking challenge throughout, and the second question that he gets is really about resurrection. And it has a socio-political kind of connotation as well as theological, because Jesus tells the story of a landowner whose slaves and son are murdered by those evil tenants. And he asks what the landowner should do about the fact. And the Pharisees and the chief priests say, well, kill him, of course. And Jesus answers something I consider a form of resurrection, which is that the stone of the builders that has been rejected is returned to become the chief cornerstone. So the thing they had thought they would get rid of actually becomes the basis for a new kind of community and a new way of being together in relationship with one another and with God. And resurrection in this sense, this kind of social, political, theological revolution, is precisely the opposite of revenge, which is what many in the Zealot movement want. Revenge out of the anger and the harm that have been caused to them. It's understandable, and Jesus even calls them, the wronged people, calls them in the hardest invitation of all to a place of not acting from revenge. It's not just a religious doctrine of life over death in the way that Jesus describes and invites us into resurrection. It is a political and social direction that is over and against a cycle of violence. It is not about vengeance. It is about renewal and justice for all people. And the next and final question he gets is what we hear. What is the essence of our calling as people who follow Christ, who follow God, who desire intimate relationship with God, and how is that manifest in the world? Perhaps those who are grilling Jesus think that they are continuing to try to entrap him, and maybe they are. But really, these questions leading up to it are not only trick questions in the way that Jesus answers them. He is inviting them to a new world view as well as a new world order. And the gathering point for Jesus that the Pharisees actually agree upon is this type of messianic expectation, the idea that they can be saved, that the world can be transformed, that their lives can achieve a quality of peace with all people and with God, and they want that by the time that Matthew is writing our gospel. His community has experienced all manner of violence at the hands of the Roman Empire, at the hands of those that they had sought relationship with within their tradition and villages, and it really is all about, are we following the precepts of empire so that we are safe and secure? Or are we taking the greater risk to basically not allow our lives and our worldview to be driven by the needs of empire and those who have power and those who would use that power to threaten the well-being of the people? Are we ready to actually turn and become the well-being of the people? Even if it puts our lives, our ways of being, our careers, our voice, our reputation within empire at risk of empire. Because we will not play the game of violence. Because we will not be silent when truth needs to be spoken. Because we will challenge where there is injustice. And where we will challenge where there is violence against the people. And that violence from empire takes so many forms, doesn't it? It takes forms that are so challenging and difficult to address because it's not all outright violence. It's not all physical violence. It's not all just suddenly tanks and tear gas appearing in the streets on behalf of security forces to silence the people. It can take much more subtle forms to silence the people, to put them in their place, to make them stop talking, to make them stop challenging justice. In fact, the oppression of the people can be something that becomes so internalized that both brown people and white people become paralyzed with fear to speak against it because of the very real risk, whether it is to physical body or benefits that could be taken away, careers that could be damaged, reputations that could basically end any ability that they have to thrive in this life. It is all about risk, and Jesus says again and again and again, it is not risk if what we are all about is securing our relationship in the world as a relationship of love. If we can secure a relationship that is informed by our love of God, by our utter commitment to God above all, then it is no longer risk, it is following the way of love. It is not risk, it is fulfilling our promise to Christ through our baptism. It is not risk, it is fulfilling the dream that God has for us all, which is to be seen and heard as the image and voice of God. So much of what is happening even right now as it was then, in the time of Jesus, in the time of Matthew, and in our day, is really about people longing to be seen and valued and heard and affirmed. And it isn't enough just to say in words, we stand with you, we care about you, we value your opinion. That is not enough. We have to change our structures and ways of being and operating in society and the world, in governance, both in our political spheres and our religious spheres. We must make intentional room for the voices and representation of all the people of God. And yes, the people who are probably most at risk are those who have spent their entire lives and careers working only for themselves, who basically represent the forces of empire that continue to this day, that consolidate power to the few, that consolidate resources to the few, that deprive the majority of the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is primarily brown people. And depriving the majority of the world from what God has created for them and in them and seeks to create through them and through all of us who are committed to the precepts that Jesus so simply lays out in the primacy of the law to love God and to love one another. The two are inextricably linked. If we profess to love God, to be dedicated to God, to be people of faith, then we must be committed to people and creation and justice. As Martin Luther King said, love on the level of society looks like justice. The theology that emerges, that Jesus introduces, is not like the theology that had gone before in the Old Testament. A theology which basically says, if we're in right relationship with God, then God promises all kinds of goodies, land and money and well-being for those who are righteous. And Jesus says that is not the right way to understand that promise. At the end of the day, we cannot look to God like some Santa Claus in the sky that's going to be good to us if we are good or fulfill all the expectations we think we should and not displease anybody. God doesn't ask us not to displease anybody. Jesus makes it very clear that if we're truly following God, we'll probably displease a lot of people who represent the forces of empire. And do not think for an instant that the forces of our church, of our Christian faith, are not informed by that empire. From the earliest days of the church, with Emperor Constantine and going forward, basically taking over and co-opting the forces of love, of all the teachings of Christ, of all that, the equity, of all the companionship, of all the genuine affection, of all that continued invitation to justice, was co-opted again and again and again as the church became part of the empire. And the churches and the faith that was brought to these shores, by the time it had come to these shores, no longer represented the essential invitation of Christ as outlined here in what is called the Shema from Leviticus, that the Pharisees and the Sadducees would have been well familiar with. The Shema from Leviticus is exactly this: you will love your neighbor as yourself. And if you look at it, we've actually heard it in our Old Testament reading today. In the Old Testament reading from Leviticus, you shall not hate in your heart any one of your kin. Who's your kin? Every freaking body. Everybody. You shall reprove your neighbor if they are not loving one another, or you will kill that guilt yourself. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Shema, the light of God that is made manifest and visible in the world by actions of love. By actions of love. One of my favorite witnesses to this, that is so simple, and yeah, Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, was a Presbyterian minister. And in the 60s, as he creates this children's show that focuses on the ethical development of children, he does it in the time period in which there's a huge color divide in this nation. And he films an episode in 1969 with a character who is representing a police officer. And for 25 years, Francois Cummings portrays a police officer, an African-American police officer. And as Clemens is portraying this in one episode in 1969, Fred Rogers invites him to take off his shoes and socks, as Mr. Rogers does himself, and they put their feet together in a small pool of water. And Mr. Rogers, when they're done, takes a small towel and wipes off Francois's feet and uses the same towel to dry his own. It is no accident that Fred chose that image of foot washing to essentially imitate the actions of Christ in receiving and caring for those people who have been othered by society and empire, by overcoming barriers in such an intimate way, by bringing people together in such an intimate way, is to enact and realize the very intimate relationship that God seeks with us. We are to live from that intimate relationship with God that is supposed to inform us, that is supposed to form us, that is supposed to transform the world. Again and again and again, our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, often talks about the transformative power of love. And he says again and again and again, if it is not about love, it is not about God. Any claims to righteousness, any claims to judgment, any claims to reproval that are not based in the desire to make our world, our nation, our lives, our neighborhoods, our churches more loving places, is simply a reproof of empire and a shaming of empire and a blaming of empire for not going along with their plan. A plan that creates and basically contributes to a society of violence, both physical, emotional, and spiritual. In the spiritual abuse of the people, the church has been historically complicit. And even as we brought to our diocesan convention in this past weekend on Friday and Saturday, we found that the ethnic ministry circles of color really raised up in profound and important, significant ways that none of us can turn away from. None of us. That our diocese and the way that we live as parishes here in the Diocese of Olympia must be reminded again and again and again. We can never assume that our people of color are having the same experience as white people of this church or diocese. We can never assume that our primary goal as a church is to be a small nonprofit business, because that is not what God calls us to. I, as a clergy person, am not called to run a small nonprofit business. That may be part of the working out of the operation of my parish and my church, but that is not what God called me to. God called me to love the people in such a way as to invite them to profound healing with one another, profound healing in the acceptance of themselves as the image of God, profound healing in relationships, and profound healing in transforming our nation and our world and our reality to conform to the precept of love your neighbor. In those three words, we have the greatest challenge of our feet. And I also will say how deeply moved I was by the response of our diocesan convention to the invitation that was laid out through 6 resolutions that were presented by Ethnic Ministry Circles of Color, networks of people of color in our diocese that really, up until November of last year, were only kind of a dream in the mind of a few. And in a few short months, and in part really stirred up and light years transformed, moved ahead in the wake of the death of George Floyd and the civil movement that followed, we suddenly found ourselves as circles of color in the Diocese of Olympia, suddenly creating and making communities, people of color, and allies to make a change in the way we live in our diocese. And yes, that included making changes in the way we do business. Because 3 of our resolutions ask for important and significant changes in our diocesan canons in order to make room for intentionally and proactively representation from peoples and communities of color on our diocesan council, on our diocesan commission on ministry, and to make explicit in the hiring and appointing practices of our church, our diocese, on including diversity, more intentionally understanding the breadth of diversity in our appointments to commissions and councils and committees. To say, we pledge as a diocese that not only do we say we want to hear our diversity and know their experience, we pledge that we will make room for them in understanding their reality. It has to be worked out in how we do business as a church. And 3 other of the resolutions, the last 3, asking for changes also in establishing a fund for those of our people of color who are being asked to be ordained in the church, to lead communities of color. And yet, because of the economic realities of those communities are not able to pay their clergy, who this church has raised up and likes to take credit for raising up, and then not being able to pay because of the nature of the communities they serve. They have never sought what much of the empire of the church has sought: a career. That's not to say that one should not have a livelihood. I'm saying the motivation has been different for those who feel called to serve minority communities. They feel called to serve because God is stirring in their hearts and they see the need and they want to respond to the need. And how they are cared for as leaders in our church, endowed with the same responsibilities of any other ordained person, is the collective responsibility of our diocese as part of our commitment to communities and people of color. And another was to add a cultural interpreter in the process of our people of color seeking ordination, so that they can both have someone to companion them on that process who understands them and supports them, but also who understands and appreciates the needs of the organization, so that those 2 cultures, minority culture and identity and dominant culture and identity, can begin to inform one another in more profound and transformative ways. It's not a contest. It's not a competition. If we are to be converted from the ways of being church as an empire church or a colony church, then we must be influenced and ready to be changed by the needs of our people of color and the voices, insights, concerns. And then finally, the last resolution was to adopt as a diocese a covenant against, an anti-racism covenant, a covenant against racism that was established in the Diocese of Missouri. And that covenant has several commitments in it, has several laments in it. It recognizes the reality of where the church has been, where it needs to go, and where our people of color are longing and needing change, so that they too can thrive within a church they love. None of these resolutions would have happened at all if our people of color did not love the church. They're not acting out of hate or revenge or any other thing, and to ask the church to be recognized as theirs also, to be changed by them, to love them enough to change. And then finally on Saturday morning we had a panel with representatives from all the different circles of color, including the Allies Circle, And as they shared stories and answered questions, it was inevitable that people would be moved by that. Because all of us belong to a church, perhaps, I hope, because we are people of compassion. And ultimately do feel called to love others. There was wisdom on that panel of all ages and all such diversity. There was profound truth-telling. I'm sure it wasn't easy for those representing what people of color experience as the Empire Church or the colonial church. I'm sure it wasn't easy for those representatives to hear the pain, to hear the impact of things that have happened because of how the church as an institution understands itself and its guiding principles and its duties and responsibilities. And we come back to this again and again and again in this simple reading from Matthew. The primary responsibility of the church and of our faith is to love one another, to love our neighbors, and to make our neighbors more than people who we other, people who we describe as being not us, but rather through the teachings of Christ to the Pharisees and the Sadducees to understand that they are not other. We are never other to one another. We are always to see in each other God, in whose image we are made. Truly, if we are fighting each other, it is only because we are fighting something more profound within ourselves. And we are called to transform the heart within us, where the Spirit dwells, and where Christ ought to reign, and where God's kingdom comes forth in every action and intention and impact of genuine love. So let us be faithful people. Let us not fear the future, and most of all, let us not fear one another, but take away the barriers, bathe our feet together, dry them off for one another, and recognize that we are together, the body of Christ, and the transformation of the world through those very actions of love. In Christ's name.